Hello there, BookTube. My name is Daniel. Welcome back to my channel, Guilty Feet. I've got no rhythm. Been a while. Sorry about that. War. But I've been watching a lot of videos, so don't think I haven't thought about you all. And thank you for anyone who got in touch. I was just watching a video from Diva Steve Donoghue where he was responding to a book olive and her top 10 classics video, and he took us through her list and then presented his own response to it. Obviously, Steve droned on about the Greeks and the Romans as if they were classics, and he also had some comments to make about Olive's choice. And the truth is, of course, they're both completely wrong. And have failed to define what is a classic. And before we go on and I present what I think would be a representative selection of 10 quite good classics, I wanted to clearly and definitively define the terms that everyone knows what we're talking about. In order for a work of literature, of which I have read some, to be defined as a classic, it must, and this is non-negotiable, it must have been published as a Penguin classic. See the clues right there in the name. Penguin classic. Those are the classics. Nothing else will do. Now, Penguin over time have generously published some books under a line of Penguin modern classics. And the clue there is in modern, breaking up the Penguin and the classic, indicating that this is not actually a classic. It's what's called a modern classic, and I have disqualified all of those. So I'm going to take you through now a series of books which, by definition, are classic, because they're published as Penguin classics, do with them as you will. Now, what I usually do when I make a video like this, and it has been a while, is I have a whole stack here that I've pre-prepared where I've gone through and taken out books. I haven't done that. So what I'm going to try and do is pause this, go away, get some books each time. I'll bring back, and hopefully, I'm going to go alphabetically, and hopefully, if I plan this correctly, I will do 10, no more, obviously. I could do more. Okay, and the trick to pausing this is I have to do Option, and then the pause button comes up. So bear with me. In the space of no time at all, I'll be back with a classic. And here we are, the first of my 10 classics, and I have chosen, starting from the A's, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And this edition was gifted to me in December 1988 when I was 19 years old. Now, to be clear, Sense and Sensibility was one of the assigned texts in my A-levels. So from the age of 16 to 18, I studied English literature in school and was doing an exam. And Sense and Sensibility was one of the books that I was answering questions on the exam. I don't think I had read the whole thing when I did that. Probably part of the reason why I didn't get an optimal grade for that exam. But sometime later, so I was in Israel. I came to Israel for a year after high school. Then I stayed a second year and then went back to university to study literature. And so this is in that in-between time in my second year. An old friend of mine who we've been friends since we were 13, 14. She recently became a grandmother for the first time, and we're still in touch and still good friends. And she sent me this copy of Sense and Sensibility and left me a very nice note in it. I was studying in seminary at the time. We didn't have TV, we didn't have mobile phones in those days. We would go and study ancient texts and then come back to our room and think about other things. And this is one of the things I thought about in those times. Probably the first Victorian novel that I read voluntarily. And I think very much, since the age, so it was a great place to start, very much the start of my reading for pleasure, and including in that reading for pleasure works which some people consider classics. This, of course, published by Penguin Classics. It says it right there on the title. This would have been a red bar, but that's faded because it sits by the window and gets a lot of sun. So these will fade a little bit. This is actually my preferred edition. I think I've said this before. My preferred version of the Penguin Classics, not the current version, which is all black with a sort of white line in the middle and a new design. These with the sort of cream back and the covers. Sometimes they're full bleed. Sometimes it's framed with the cream border. But this is where I started my reading journey of classic and Victorian literature and older occasionally, but mostly I'm trying to think of the choices that I'm going to bring out today, mostly in that Victorian era, so 19th century. And I love Sensibility. I love the movie that Emma Thompson wrote and won an Oscar for writing. But I read, having been assigned this and not read it, and then having been gifted it by a friend who had written a note about how she had enjoyed it, I took it upon myself to read it in a time where there was not much else to do, and fell in love with it all again. I went and read all of Jane Austen, and sort of kick-started my reading career. So that is book one of my list, Sensibility by Jane Austen. I love Pride and Prejudice as well. Emma, of course, maybe my favourite, is an obvious choice, but Sense and Sensibility was right there at the start and kickstarted everything. That is book one of 10 classics, which are quite good. Right, now I need to do the pause again. Here we go. No, wrong one. That one. And back now with book two on my list of classics. A little bit of a cheat, because this isn't actually published as a Penguin, even though this definitely has been published as a Penguin classic. But this edition was one I bought here in Israel in a second-hand bookshop soon after. So the date that I marked in the copy of Sense and Sensibility was December 88. This is marked March 89. So still 19 years old, still studying in seminary. I love, they used to look after these second-hand books where they would tape up the corners. This is actually from a second-hand bookshop which doesn't exist anymore, and about 150 yards from where I'm sitting right now, that I must have, I used to come when I lived in Israel, when I was living in Israel back then. I used to come and stay with my cousins who were here in this town that I live now, and I must have gone into the bookshop there and bought this. Oh yeah, this is the way they used to do it in the second-hand bookshop. You see this, sorry, this letter F. Books were marked with letter A to Z, Z as we used to say, and then double A, double B, double C, and then there was a handwritten list on the wall of what each letter of the alphabet, what it corresponded to. F is fairly near the start of the alphabet, where A would have been a matter of pennies, and I would limit myself in those days very much. I was a student living off the good grace and kindness of my parents before I ever earned a penny or went to study university. And so I would spend a very, very little amount of money. So I would not buy books. I never got to M in the alphabet. That would have been, too much of a financial outlay for the books that I was purchasing to read. But this is my copy of Jane Eyre, which, as you see, this was called those days the Penguin English Library. Not even a Penguin classic. This would have been a bright orange spine. You can't see very clearly the Penguin English Library. I happen to know, and you'll have to trust me, that the Jane Eyre has been published by Penguin Classics with the red bar and the black spine. And I again, this is before I went to university to study literature. This is me voluntarily, as a 19-year-old young man, finding my way in the world, saying, oh, I really should read Jane Eyre. And I really should have done, because this had a remarkable impact on me, probably more because I read it voluntarily. I know most of you come to books voluntarily, and I, as a lover of books, do and want everyone to come to books voluntarily. But there was a time when we were in school where we were assigned books, and that natural instinct to push back. Well, it was a school book, and there are some books I read in school which I love still, but this was never assigned to me in school. I picked this up because it was the right price at the right time, and I had time on my hands in between studying the Talmud or not studying the Talmud, and I would sit and read this, and just was a very special time, an amazing book for me. Jane Eyre, usually the answer to when I'm asked the question, what's your favourite book of all time, usually say Jane Eyre, because it was so impactful, and that last chapter still, if I ever am feeling contemplative, I can just come here, open up the back of the book, read the first 4 words of the last chapter, and sit and have a good cry in the corner, because even understanding that it's a toxic relationship, that Rochester is an arsehole, all these things are true, and yet those 4 words that kick off the closing chapter, I find hopeful and wistful, and just about the most romantic thing that I had ever read as a reader. That is number 2 in my list of top 10 quite good classics, Charlotte Bronte by Jane Eyre. I'm going to pause again. Back now with number 3 in my list of Penguin classics, don't even need the word penguin because it's understood. If it's published by Penguin Classic, it's a classic. Top 10 quite good Penguin classics. And this is, I'm picking The Last of the Mohicans, which is the obvious one of the series. This is the second in the Hawkeye series, in the Leatherstocking novels, the 5 books to feature Natty Bumppo, the most well-known title. So even if you have never read Fenimore Cooper, you will probably know the title, The Last of the Mohicans. We were assigned this, so I come back to university in 8. This is all falling chronologically, even though alphabetically. I come back to university in summer of '89 and start university in London studying English literature. And one of the books we were assigned, I think I was doing a course in English and American literature, even though in my head I had never distinguished between the two previously. I guess I knew some authors were American and some were English. But in the course of American literature, we were assigned The Deerslayer, which is the first of the Leatherstocking novels. And being slightly, I don't know what the word is, I don't want to pigeonhole anyone in any kind of neurological sense. But once I had read The Deerslayer, and I knew there were 4 more novels in the series, I had to work my way through them. I don't actually have a date in this, but I bought this second hand. There's the pencil up there, £3.50, even though the cover price on this is £5.99, which is still, I mean, that was expensive for a paperback book in those days. This is, I'm guessing, this is summer. It's early 1990. I'm in university. I'm studying English literature. We assigned The Deerslayer, and I went through the rest of the series, of which The Last of the Mohicans is just bloody exciting. So this is early 19th century relative to say Brontes and Jane Austen, or Jane Austen's quite early, I guess. So this is sort of, when's this one? 1820s. 1826 this is first published, so certainly relative to the Brontes this is much earlier. Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre sort of 1848 1850, around that time. Bloody exciting, really good. The Deerslayer was fantastic, and I read the next 3 volumes as well after this. Gave me a real sense of kinetic writing and adventure and excitement and sort of nobility. Natty Bumppo is a tremendous character. I mean, I haven't read these in coming on for 40 years, but they stuck with me and informed a lot of my reading of thrillers and that anything with action and movement in it. The writing here is all about that, and it reflected very well in mostly forgotten but never underrated movie version of The Last of the Mohicans, with directed by Michael Mann, with Daniel Day-Lewis, of course, as Hawkeye, Natty Bumppo. Just a tremendously exciting kinetic movie that sits very well alongside Heat, another Michael Mann movie, but it's all here in the original text, at least in my memory. Maybe the two have got confused. Maybe a scholar would tell me, no, this is much more sedate. But I think there is an urgency here that I found thrilling, that continues, and I read the rest of the series, and they're fantastic, and not much talked about on BookTube. I think none of these books, maybe few people read Last of the Mohicans, but that entire Leatherstocking series, which was really formative in my reading of literature. Number 3 in my list of quite good books, which are clearly classics because it says so on the title. Pause now, 1 second. This is number 4. Now, and again, kind of an obvious choice. I've got here David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I'm not the biggest Dickens head, in as much I haven't read all of Dickens yet. I've listened to Diva Steve say how Dickens is not. He doesn't think Dickens is the be all and end all of Victorian literature. I haven't read exhaustively Dickens. I've read like 4 or 5 of the novels, and some of which I think are excellent, and some have sort of been a struggle. Bleak House was most recently a struggle, and I haven't sort of gone back since then. I read Hard Times, and I've read Great Expectations. I've never read Oliver Twist, which probably should, it might be more accessible. But I loved Great Expectations, and I really loved David Copperfield, which I think is described as his most autobiographical novel, and it's a great big chunkster, published by Penguin Classics. Right there, it tells you what it is on the cover, and again the faded red bar on the back, and this was kind of wonderful. When did I purchase this? At least this is 2001. So already I'm living in Israel at that point, and traveling for business. I must have read this on planes flying to and from the States, and enjoy that very much. So recommend David Copperfield. Maybe not a great gateway into Dickens. Maybe Great Expectations is a slightly slimmer novel. Hard Times is quite slim, but it wasn't a great experience for me. Great Expectations may be before David Copperfield, but for me, David Copperfield is the best of Dickens that I've read so far. Pausing again. And we're back. Another book now, going back in time in terms of my reading. This is actually bought this in January '94, and again cheating a little bit because it's Penguin English Library, not a Penguin Classic. Although of course this is published by Penguin Classics, which is how you know it's a classic. And this is, I'm talking about George Eliot's Daniel Deronda. I read so age 18. I came to Israel. Spend time on a kibbutz in a group of 40 of us, most of whom I knew. We're all come up in a youth group together, and we all came to Israel to spend time on kibbutz and travel around the country, etc. And then I stayed a second year with a subset of that group, and went to seminary. And I brought with me on that first year. This is, the arrogance of an 18-year-old. I had a very strong relationship with my English teacher in high school, even though I horribly underperformed and disappointed everybody. And one of the things that he had recommended to me was Middlemarch. And so I went to school after, in the school holidays, didn't break into it, the door was open, but I walked into school. I went to a big private school in outside London, and I just drove in with friends, went to the storeroom where they kept all the books that were handed out, and just help myself. And one of the books that I helped myself to was a copy of Middlemarch, which I then brought with me to kibbutz and read, after spending days working in a field and come back in smelly and sweaty. You'd have a shower and you'd cover yourself in talcum powder and just sit there in the sweltering heat. And I read Middlemarch and think I lent it to a couple of people, and maybe it sort of went round after I'd done it. That was a great experience. Later on, back in London, after I'm studying literature, this is even after my degree, I read more of Eliot, and I read The Mill and the Floss, and I read Adam Bede, and it came to Daniel Deronda cold. It was just another of George Eliot's novels, Silas Marner, which I don't really like, just another of George Eliot's novels that I was working my way through, and picked up Daniel Deronda, and just remained blown away by this book and what it's about. And I had a different experience than I did with Middlemarch. Everyone talks about Middlemarch as this transcendent work of Victorian literature, and I'm okay with that. Daniel Deronda is got all that love story thing, but the book is named for this character, Daniel Deronda, who, as he's going through this process, gets more in touch with his Jewish identity, and the fulfillment of that Jewish identity is a sense of the need for Jewish belonging, and the idea very much present in the book that is best fulfilled by moving to Israel. This is proto-Zionism. This is written years before the first Zionist Congress, years before what we talk about, the birth of political Zionism in the 1880s, 1890s, and then that first Zionist Congress in Basel, in Switzerland in 1896. Is that right? And this predates all of that, but has a character very much thinking about Jewish self-determination and being part of a Jewish community and the fulfillment of one's life as a Jew. Now, I'm not going to blame my decision to move to Israel with my wife and small baby on George Eliot. That would be churlish. I was already thinking about where I wanted my life to be, and how I wanted to move through the world, and Israel was already a big part of that. But finding a voice, thinking about those things in literature, in Victorian literature, was very meaningful for me. At the same time, those of you who ever watched EastEnders in England may remember there was Dr. Legg, who was, I think, maybe the only Jewish character in EastEnders back in the early days. There was some point he had a nephew who was staying with him, a nephew and his family, also Jews, obviously, and not obviously, and there was just a minuscule storyline in this this not main character in this twice weekly soap opera. And Dr. Legg's nephew, something happens and something else happens. I don't even know what happens. But at the end of it, the guy says, okay, that's, we've made the decision. We're going to live in Israel. So at the same time, I'm reading about Daniel Deronda, also was happening on EastEnders. And not long after I read this, within a couple of years of me reading this, we actually made the move and moved to Israel. So Daniel Deronda, important book. I mean, an amazing book, I'm sure in its own right, meaningful for me in my journey through literature and my sort of journey across the planet. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, pausing again. Oh, wrong now. Yes, here I am now with book 6 in my top 10 classics that are quite good. Again, you can see on the top, it's a classic because Penguin Classics published it. And this is going back to that year in seminary. I had an acquaintance of the female persuasion during that year that I was studying in seminary. And she was studying in university. So we had met my first year in Israel. I stayed a second year to study, and she stayed in Israel and went to university and stayed here all the way through, and still lives here, although we're sort of out of touch. And I went to visit her at her university, which is maybe 25 minutes from where I am now, sort of between here and Tel Aviv. And she was studying literature, and I was still I was going back to London at the end of my year to study literature, and she showed me around the campus there and took me into the bookshop. There was a bookshop next to the library, and they had Penguin Classics, I think, remarkably cheaply priced, possibly because, well, so for example, I'm talking about Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, which has a price on the back in pounds, £1.60, which you saw that the James Fenimore Cooper book that I had, which I bought in the UK, no more than 2 years later, was £5.99. So these Thomas Hardys, either they were bigger sellers and so they could price them cheaply, but that was that was cheaper than a contemporary paperback book. So classics in those days, or at least my early experience was that they were actually cheaper. If you wanted to buy a classic, specifically a Penguin classic, it was cheaper than buying a modern paperback book. And in shekel, in Israeli currency, this was well within my budget. I believe I paid about 6 shekel for this, which was cheap. It was maybe £2 in those days, and felt like the right thing. And this was my gateway Hardy. You can see that £5.89, so it was still here before I came back to London to study. As it happens, I think it's Hardy's first novel. Now, if you're a purist, you're supposed to understand that Hardy's poetry is superior to Hardy's novels. I haven't read much of Hardy's poetry. Did a course in it, or it came up in a module at university, and didn't fall in love with it. But I have read a whole bunch of Hardy's novels. So this is the first one, and I put here, one second there, I took them off the shelf so I could get to this one because this was at the bottom. I've read most of, if not all, of Hardy's novels. And he's an odd duck, but there was something about these books that appealed to me in my early, this is turning 20, just I bought this, so in my early 20s, when I went through the rest of them, there was something I found very appealing about Hardy. And the first one stayed with me, Bathsheba Everdeen, and there's the terrible, terrible story of all the Gabriel Oakes sheep going over the cliff in the storm, just all so sort of romantic and melodramatic and wonderful, and then tragic, after I read a couple, Mayor of Casterbridge and Tess the D'Urbervilles, just terrible. And then you get to Jude the Obscure, which is just grueling and sad. But then there are some light ones later on, Trumpet Major and Under the Greenwood Tree, and which sort of lightened the load. So the heavy stuff came earlier on. I just had a good journey with Hardy, so that they all remain very fond and dear to me. And this is where it all started. So this is right back in that same time that I'm discovering Austen and the Brontes. I discovered Thomas Hardy as well. That's Far from the Madding Crowd. Book 6 in my list of classics, clues in the title, that are quite good. Pause 1 second. Option. Next up, 8, I think. 7. number 7 in my list, I believe. An author that doesn't get spoken about very much. It's kind of a lost or a black hole in BookTube. I'd love to get Diva Steve's take on this author. Again, this was he was assigned to me when I got to university, and that's summer before. I was given a reading list before I went to university. I was working as a hospital porter, wheeling people to and from physio and occupational therapy appointments. And I went through my pre-university reading list that summer after I came back from seminary, the summer of '89. And we were assigned, there were 2 books by this author on my assigned reading list, and the author is Henry James, and we were assigned to read the Europeans and the Bostonians, both of which I worked through, and didn't, again, they were assigned. So after a period of reading for pleasure and discovering authors, I was assigned an author that I hadn't read before, and didn't have a fabulous experience, but sort of pushed on and read a bit more. I haven't read Henry James in any great depth. I think I've got 6 books by Henry James, including What Amazing... The thing I should say about Henry James, we were in school, in high school, we were given, or we read The Turn of the Screw. So my first experience with Henry James was this ghost story, and I do not like horror, and I do not like ghost stories, and The Turn of the Screw is chilling. And then we were assigned an essay that was based on a quote by Henry James, about let the reader think the evil, let him think it for himself, and it was, and this I think continues. I don't remember the whole quote, but that was something like that was the topic that we were given, and we were supposed to write an essay about The Turn of the Screw, which is because the whole thing is allowing the mind of the reader to fill in the blanks. There's very little. There's no gore or terror or horror as we know horror today in the text of The Turn of the Screw, but the whole thing is so relentlessly creepy and terrifying, and super effective. But that's probably the last scary book that I read. So I won't say I'd never read Henry James before. I'd read Turn of the Screw, but in school, and then I was assigned Europeans and the Bostonians. But then later I sort of came back, and there were other Henry James books that I came to read, and this is one of them. And this is The Portrait of the Lady, which is chunkier. I think we were probably assigned the Europeans and the Bostonians because they were relatively small. Or lighter books, 200, 300 pages, and Portrait of a Lady is a bit chunkier, but marvelous. Isabel Archer, Gilbert Osmond. I just had a terrific experience with this. And when is this book? I don't know why nobody talks about Henry James. He's born 1843, so he's writing in the late 19th century or the later 19th century. And when is the Portrait of the Lady? First published 1881. So this predates Wharton, who we won't really get to because I don't have anything published by her by Penguin Classics, and this is all about the classics, not modern classics, not 20th century classics, Penguin Classics. But there's a direct link from Henry James to Edith Wharton, of course, and I think specifically Portrait of a Lady and Age of Innocence, I think, are probably good buddy reads for each other. So I brought this up just because after having a sort of stutter start with Henry James, I read this, and so now I think of him, I remember him fondly, and always it's kind of surprised that no one talks about him so much. We talk a lot about the mid 19th century writers and the female writers of the 19th century. I mean, even Elizabeth Gaskell gets, who I skipped over, even though I love Cranford very much. And Henry James, not so much. I left out here also, I'm going alphabetical order, left out George Gissing's New Grub Street, which might be the only Gissing published by Penguin Classics. So I have had to read other works by Gissing published by Oxford University Press, for God's sake. But that's also kind of thing. Also not George Gissing, also not discussed very much. I don't make this like a male author versus a female author thing, but James and very much Gissing, I think, on a par and should be at least given the same amount of airspace as some of their amazing female writing contemporaries. Okay, that is book 7 or 8. I'll let you know when I get. I'm going to pause now, and when I do the next one, I'll tell you whether I'm on 8 or 9. Hold on one second. Okay, that was 7. So this is 8. 8 in my list of top 10 Penguin Classics. And you know they're Penguin Classics because, here, one second. Let's see if I can do this. Oh no, I've screwed this up already. Classics, it says it right there. Penguin, oh, and this one, no, I've got the Penguin Classics. Morrissey's autobiography, published as a Penguin Classic. People have been chasing Morrissey for a long time to get him to write a book, and his insistence was he said he would only agree to write a book for the company if it were published as a Penguin Classics. And just for the chutzpah, just for the Morrissey-ness of it, and I'm remain, to my probably discredit, a massive fan of the man and his music, even of the man a little bit. He's probably not a great human being, but Morrissey fan. And Fan Smiths, of course. And this was, just everything you would want from Morrissey's autobiography. Chunky, irreverent. He puts on voices. It's just magnificent. And the fact that it was published as Penguin Classics. First of all, all joking aside, the fact that Penguin Classics published Morrissey's new autobiography as a Penguin Classic. And when did this come out? Like in the last 10 years? Maybe I'm misremembering how long ago this was. No, a second, what's that? It published in 2013, so it's more than 10 years ago. Because this was published as a paperback, Penguin Classics, $8.99. That's not a bad price for a new book. It kind of makes a mockery of the whole discussion about what is a classic. Even my pretty clear-cut definition, the fact that Penguin Classics agreed to this and published it as Penguin Classic, I think is puts one's tongue firmly in cheek throughout this whole discussion. But I include it in my list of Penguin Classics because it's a classic. It says so on the cover. Penguin Classics, Morrissey. Not for everybody, but if it's for you, then we're in a club. Probably a thoroughly discredited one, but still a club, and I'll take it. Here we are. That was number 8. So 2 more to go. Hold on to your hats. Okie dokie, we're back, and I've only got 2 more books to talk about on the list of top 10 classics. And I've got quite near the end of the alphabet, but I seem to have a lot of books. So it's just some quick mentions. These are all things that didn't make the list, but they're classics, obviously. Some of which are rarely talked about on BookTube, so I'd like to give them a good shout. First of all, I've got this excellent edition of Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott, published by, you guessed it, Classics, a classic. Steve made some disparaging remarks about one of Olive's choices because it was a play. It shows them some Oscar Wilde. Here, look, a play. That's a classic. It says so right there. George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. I loved reading this. I grew up on My Fair Lady, which I always knew was based on Pygmalion. But when I read Pygmalion, I was amazed about how much of that original story is baked into Shaw's original. Here, another classic. Says it right in the title. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. A revelation when I read it. So I was assigned reading for my start of university Tristram Shandy, but I've only got an Oxford World Classic, so here is another Lawrence Sterne, Sentimental Journey, quite light, rarely spoken about. Sterne was born in 1713, so this is an 18th century book, very easy, very gatewayable. If you want to read something, that's the red that's supposed to be on there. Penguin Classic, Sentimental Journey. What did I pay for this? £1.25 in 1995. Another obvious one, and because it says on the title, this is a classic, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Again, not the story that you think you know, and tremendously readable. I got here, not a great book, but I brought it up because we're going to, this is foreshadowing, we're going to meet her next door neighbour in a few books' time. This is Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, and that is by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the only thing you really got from this is that it growed and growed like Topsy. What else? Didn't even have room for, Can You Ever Forgive Me, for Trollope, even though I'm still enjoying a lot of Trollope. I started with The Ward, and that's probably the best in the gateway into Trollope. And then, of course, if we're talking about classics, Penguin Classics, defining things as a classic, I read this last week. So still keeping up with the classics. This is Black Panther, published by Penguin Classics. It says it right there. Oh, it doesn't. Does it say? Oh, yeah, it does. Right there on the title. It's a classic, clearly. This is early stories of the Black Panther from his first appearance in Fantastic Four through a long run, a long arc in a long forgotten comic called Jungle Action. We don't see many comic books called Jungle Action featuring a black cast of characters these days, thankfully. But Black Panther was deemed to be, Jungle Action was deemed to be the right place to bring back Black Panther, which was written by a white writer and initially drawn by a white artist until a black artist took over. And the arc that is produced here, and the comic was published once every 2 months. So an arc over 12 issues would have taken 2 years for the reader to keep up with. And the arc is called Panther's Rage, I believe. Yeah. This was my first time reading it. And so much of the stuff that's in that arc from the early 1970s in Panther's Rage, which was published in Jungle Action once every 2 months over a period of 2 years, all found its way into the billion-dollar selling movie Black Panther from a few years ago, which is a terrific movie. I don't think comics were quite as sophisticated back then, but still, all the good stuff, all the stuff about Black Panther and his responsibility to his people and Killmonger and what he represents, and the fight between two black people in Africa with no white saviors, no one coming to save the people of the continent from marvelously sophisticated Europe. It's all embedded into that story, written by a gentleman called Don McGregor, and it all came to the fore, like, how many, almost 50 years later, 40 years, 45 years later, in a movie that resonated around the world, and also clearly a classic. Okay, so my books 9 and 10 I've got coming up here are on my actual list. I couldn't leave this out. That's why I had to leave all those out, because I wanted to get to Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, which, believe it or not, is my gateway into Tolstoy. I went from this to War and Peace, which I don't have in Penguin Classics. I found some old hardback, and then maybe better translations of all of these. Like, people who know this stuff may have read through 3 or 4 different versions and different translations, and my experience with it is as I found it. Anna Karenina was mind-blowingly good. War and Peace I just adored, and I've read some more Tolstoy. I read Resurrection and some short stories, and maybe my favourite 19th century novelist, because I find him so human and smart and empathetic. Anna Karenina was my way, and this was someone else. Somebody borrowed it from me, who seems to have got like 3/4 of the way through, stuck a tissue in, and then gave it back to me. And then I wanted to finish as a book Olive did. As I said, I mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe when I was in Connecticut in summer 2019, staying with friends that my son was just at last weekend, who live in Westport. But my wife and I went for a drive, and we went to the Mark Twain house and discovered that next door to the Mark Twain house was where Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame lived. And so I thought I would end as a book Olive did, with a Mark Twain. Not quite, I haven't read that. Her choice was the Recollections of Joan of Arc, which if you had tortured me, I might not have even known that was a book by Mark Twain. I haven't read it, even though I've read a fair number of Mark Twain books. But the one I've chosen is this, A Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court. So avoiding Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, both of which I love. I've got some follow-ups to Tom Sawyer Detective, and then I read some of the non-fiction, Life in the Mississippi, and A Tramp Abroad, and whatever, all those as well. And I thought I'd come back to this just because it's rollicking good fun, a terrific read, and bought this in again November '95. So I moved to Israel in January '96, so I would have brought this with me and read this in those early months that I was here with my wife and young child. And the best thing about A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, as with many of the books that I mentioned, are the movie versions. The beauty of this, it gave us one of the greatest movie songs of all time, I believe my rendition now bears a positive comparison with Bing Crosby's, because of course from the movie A Connecticut Yankee in The Court of King Arthur, is it? Is the name slightly different in the movie? You get Bing Crosby singing, I'm busy doing nothing, working the whole day through, trying to find lots of things not to do. I'm busy going nowhere, isn't it just a crime? I'd like to be unhappy, but I never do have the time. I think it's we. It's all third person. Anyway, that's from the movie, Bing Crosby, Mark Twain. These are the classics. Read whatever you like. Any book you think is a classic is probably a classic. But if it says Penguin Classics actually on the cover, then that's your guarantee. Take care. God bless. Bye.